Good morning, everyone. Welcome to my video call. Today's topic is Azure Migrate. Firstly, just to give a little bit of information about myself, my name is Matthew Foster. I work for a company called Risual. I've worked with them for 3 years, and in the Azure realm as a cloud infrastructure consultant. And I've been in the IT industry for about 25 years, and in the Azure field for about 8. So as we say, let's crack on with the chat about Azure Migrate. So, what we're going to talk about today? Well, firstly, what is Azure Migrate? Secondly, how to set up discovery. Third, how to set up replication. Fourth, how to perform a test migration. Fifth, how to perform a full migration or cutover. And finally, 6, clean up the migration infrastructure. Okay, so what is Azure Migrate? Well, Azure Migrate, as the slide is telling us, is a Microsoft service that helps small, medium or big companies assess their on-premises environment and plan for moving all or some of it into the cloud. So let's put that in a little bit of an example for now. You're a medium company, you've got 100 servers that are currently sat in either on-premise in a data center, or actually physical servers in your data room, comms room. You have a meeting, a planning strategy meeting, and you decide that you want to move all the machines up into Azure to save on costs of the data center. So how do you go about doing that? Well, this is where Azure Migrate comes in, because Azure Migrate provides a simplified migration, modernization, and optimization service. So the migration process itself, as I'll explain through this video, is very simple. Then that modernizes us because obviously a lot of companies are moving away from the traditional data center on-prem and even physical server rooms to start reducing costs and saving money, making the businesses more streamlined. And the optimization service side of it is, as I'll explain later on, is that the service, the Azure Migrate, when it does its discovery, it tries to optimize to make sure that you're not using an Azure virtual machine that's too big, costing you a lot of money per month, that isn't needed for the workload that you're putting in there. But I'll explain more about that through the call. So you want to do it, your board has made, or the team has made a decision, you want to do Migrate. So how do we set up discovery? Well, here's a diagram of a typical area. You've got your Microsoft Azure tenant up there with probably very basic setup at first, depending on how much you're actually wanting to move into Azure. And here we have the on-premise side of thing. So it could be that you've got a VMware vCenter system, or you could have Hyper-V host, or as I said, you could have physical servers in a data center. So first and foremost, the first step is to download and configure the appliance. This is done by putting an agent on there, and that allows that migration appliance to work. So here's a picture which has been highlighted. This is the migration appliance. So we open up HTTPS on port 443 for that appliance to be able to liaise with Microsoft Azure, etc., and work with all the discovery. So this appliance must be able to communicate to all the machines that it's trying to discover. So obviously that will be sorted via an agent and a service, etc., which I'll explain in the next slide. So after you've downloaded and configured the appliance, you would do the second part, which is to start the discovery, which goes away to your 100 servers or 10 servers, depending on what you're going to do. It goes away to get an idea of what RAM, what CPU, what applications, what dependencies, etc., are needed on that machine. And it also monitors their sort of metrics throughout the day. What it then does from the discoveries creates what's called an assessment. So it's a migration assessment. And what this does is it's a simplified list of all the machines, all the machine names, and again, the machine CPU, the machine memory, the dependencies, etc. And therefore, you've got a glorified spreadsheet with all the information on. And then obviously what that allows you to do is you then decide the plan, the migration plan of what you're going to do to replicate things. So that is the simplified process that will come into use. And so with this in mind, just to give you an overall rundown back on this, it's a unified migration platform. So it's a single portal to start, run, discover, migrate, etc. for all your on-premise information into Azure. And there's a range of tools within there, and they will provide you with a lot of good information that will allow you to make good judgment calls on what you want to move and how you want to scope and size things. So we've set up discovery. It's gone off. It's spent maybe 7 days, 30 days, etc. Going looking at what you've got on premise. What's the next step? How to set up replication. So straight away, your replication is basically doing very similar to what Robocopy would do in that respect, in that it is getting a sync of the information that currently is on that server. So if you were to literally lift and shift that server from on-premise into Azure at this moment, you sync the data to get a replication at that moment. Now, what that does is it doesn't just do one. It'll do the initial one, and then it does what's called a delta sync, because it'll then keep monitoring that server and waiting if there's any changes. So for example, if you were doing a file server, every time a file is updated or a share is updated, the sync, the next time it does a sync, it will know there's been a change. It will do the replication to make sure it's aware of the changes, so that the minute you go for doing any of your migrations, you have the latest version of that server to move across. So again, we look at the diagram over here, and you've got the VMware or the physical server side of things, and we've talked about the HTTPS port 443 for the replication data, etc. So within the appliance, it has a process server and a configuration server, and also uses this mobility service agent. So again, previous to what we was just talking about, this mobility service agent must be on all machines that you want to discover. Otherwise, again, you will have problems getting discovery from all your machines. But the configuration server and the process server is installed by default on the replication appliance, and the configuration server allows you to set up where it's going to communicate with. So what this replication appliance does is coordinate the communications and manages the data replication for your on-prem VMware or your physical servers replicating to Azure. Also, as part of the replication appliance, there is a replication gateway, and that acts as a replication gateway to receive replication data from the machines enabled for replication. It optimizes that replication data with caching, compression, and encryption, and sends it over to Azure. So therefore, yeah, it's encrypted so that nobody from the public domain can see what's on your servers. It's compressed so that it's in the smallest format, because you don't want a 2 terabyte server, for example, taking up that much space in Azure, etc. So again, as we talked about as well, and then the agent install, which is it performs a push installation of the mobility service agent to the relevant machines that you list that you want to discover. So, and again, we've got 3 steps to the replication. You've downloaded and configured the appliance to work. You've started the replication. So for example, in my example here, we'll have a file server that's being done. It's replicating up into Azure, and then in Azure will be a replicated copy of that server ready if you wanted to migrate it. And as I say, it orchestrates this replication over the port 443. Okay, replication's occurring, and the continual delta sync replication is occurring. You're now going to come to the potential day when you want to start migrating and cutting over. What's the next step? That is a test migration. So as the name suggests, test migration provides a way to test and validate migrations prior to the actual migration. It works by letting you use what's called a sandbox environment or a development environment in Azure to test the virtual machines before the actual migration. The sandbox environment, or again, development environment, is demarcated by a test virtual network you specify. So again, in your production environment, you'd have a production virtual network. You must have either a test network or what's called an isolated VNet for testing your migrations, because obviously when you're moving your machines up into Azure, the production machines go into the production environment, but you don't want to test the migration into the production environment. It's better that it's in an isolated virtual network. So what you do is you do a test migration. And what this does is it tests the end-to-end process for going off and getting the latest replication, make sure it's up to date, and then checks the process of moving that server into Azure. And as part of that replication and as part of that test migration, if you wanted to change the name of the server that you've got, you could do, or you can leave it the same. You could even decide what type of disk you want on there, whether you want a standard HDD, standard SSD, or a premium disk. So you can make all those decisions when you're doing the replication, and it tests it when it does the migration. Okay, so you've done a test migration. It's not failed, although if it does fail, you just look at the error message and resolve whatever issue it is. Usually the issue revolves around the replication appliance, be it a permission issue or a connection issue, i.e. ports open or not. Okay, so it's test migrated, it's passed, no problem. What's the next step? Well, that is then what's called the full migration, or as I mentioned in the earlier slide, a cutover migration. So the process to do this is you've created the Azure Migrate project, which is where you get all the discovery, etc. for all your servers. You've done the replication, you've done the test migration. So you go into the project, you go to servers, you go to Azure Migrate, and you click on server migration and look for the replicating servers. In there will be the replicating machines. You find the list of all the different machines that you've replicated. You found the file server, for example, that you want to do. You right click on it and click migrate. Off that goes. It asks you a first simple question, which is, do you want to shut down the on-premise machine? Obviously, yes, you don't want a duplication, because you don't want a machine running on-prem and an exact replica running in Azure, especially if you're using the same network addresses, or you're using one where you don't want it to have a duplication of IPs. So yes or no to that message. Obviously, the default is yes. You shut down the machine, and away the process goes. It will perform a planned shutdown of that machine, and then it goes ahead and does the migration process, which again, as stated on the test migration one, is it will go and get the latest replication Delta Sync from that machine as of the time you press migrate, and it will then start to do the process, which one part of that process is to create what's called a virtual machine in Azure. So that's then therefore using the Delta replication and making a new machine in Azure as if it was just being physically lifted and shifted. All the sizing, etc., as I mentioned before, is already predetermined when you do the replication, because you determine the size, which of course, again, as we look at the discovery side of things, the discovery is where it tells you whether that machine needs to be, for example, an F2S or an F4S, V2 machine, etc. And these machines are all different sizes, different specifications, and obviously the higher it goes up, they cost more. Okay, so the migration job starts, and the process can take anything from 15-20 minutes up to an hour, 2 hours sometimes, depending on the size of the machine that you're moving and maybe if it's got a SQL database, etc. But it's all dependent on the size of it. So again, as per the test migration, the migration is successful or not. If it fails, you have to look at what the problem is and then restart the migration, or you may even have to restart replication. Depends on what the error is. But let's say you've had a successful migration. So now you have a machine that's shut down on premise, but you've got an exact replica of it as if it was spun up and moved within literally minutes into Azure, and it runs, and you've got all the permissions you can set up on that machine as per normal. So step 6, we talk about what's the next step after you've done the full migration and everything's fine. You're happy that file server's running fine in Azure. You've not got a problem with it. What do you do next? Well, that is just the easy way. But as you do with anything that you do within the IT realm, and especially in Azure, is make sure you clean up your migration infrastructure, because, excuse me, you don't want there to be the replication copies, because that replication copy sits there and takes up resources and storage on your Azure tenant, costing you money again. So here, an example on the screen, we're just going to stop the replication. So you'll see on the right hand side for this server that's been chosen, we've done the test migration. We can clean up the test migration. You can do that, which just gets rid of that from your isolated network. We've got the migration, that's been done. And then the last thing to do is to do stop replication. What that does is then that gets rid of the replicated copy that's sitting in your storage account in the Azure Migrate project, gets rid of anything that revolves around that, and then it's cleaned up, and then on to the next migration. That is the process end to end. I hope it's been beneficial for you. Talk to you soon. Bye-bye.